Hello, good afternoon, Pnawn da. Thank you very much for all of you for joining. Um, Welcome, croeso to this lunchtime's launch webinar. My name's Stefan Evans, and I'm the Bevan Foundation's CEO. And I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues Isoton and Al this afternoon to talk through some work that they've been leading on um, around access to justice issues in Wales, and in particular around issues around the legal aid system. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the Bevan Foundation more broadly, we're a think tank that works on finding long-term solutions to poverty and inequality in Wales, and improving access to justice, in particular for migrants, has been a key part of our work now for a number of years, and we're really, really pleased to bring this report today. I'm not going to talk much about the detail. I'm going to leave that for Isis and Al, but just wanted to thank the Welsh Government for funding this particular piece of work, but also to thank Justice Together initiative for their work and supporting the broader work that we've been doing around this, which has enabled us to develop and bring together what I hope you agree is a really, really important report and piece of research that is being launched today. So without any further ado, Isis, over to you.
Hello and welcome. I'm Isata. I'm the Bevan Foundation's head of policy for our migration stream of work, and I've been working on this project along with Eleanor Matty, my colleague, and over the next 20 minutes we're going to take you through some of the key areas in the report. We won't cover everything. There is a lot more detail and data in the report, but the full report is available to download from our website now, and from today. Thanks. So to put the report in some context, this is the first output in our project developing the immigration advice sector in Wales. As many of you will know, the immigration legal sector is in crisis, not just in Wales, but across the UK. And a lot of the control and the responsibility for that sits at UK government level. Immigration policy is reserved, to Westminster, and the legal aid scheme is administered at a UK government level. But we believe that there's a lot we can do in a devolved sphere to protect the legal services that we have, to strengthen those services, and to develop new ones. And so we wanted to get together as many people as possible to see whether we could collaboratively develop a strategy to protect those services and to develop them. The project is funded by Welsh Government, but the work is independent and it takes place in 3 stages. This is the end of the first stage. There'll be another publication at the end of January, and the final strategy will be published in March. There's lots of opportunity to get involved, so if you do want to engage in that, please do get in touch. This report maps provision across Wales. We've got some updated statistics on key groups who need immigration legal advice, and we've built on the work of Joe Wilding to carry out an updated calculation of primary legal aid deficit. Where possible, we've broken down the data in the report into local authority areas, but we couldn't always do that, sometimes because data isn't disaggregated to Wales or because there's just a single total provided. And it's also important to say that there are large gaps in the data, especially around that area of unmet need, which we'll look at later on. So firstly, we looked at the need for immigration legal advice in 2024 and to 25. This slide doesn't show all of the groups, but it's the key groups who would be looking for legal advice. The groups outlined in orange are cases which would be firmly within the scope of legal aid, and those outlined in purple are cases which would not normally be eligible for legal aid without an application for exceptional case funding. Exceptional case funding is legal aid funding which is provided for people whose cases aren't ordinarily within scope, but who, if they didn't get legal aid, would be at risk of having their human rights breached. And I should say that exceptional case funding is virtually unavailable in Wales because it's just not financially viable for providers to offer. And so we can only conclude that people living in Wales are not having their human rights protected by the legal aid scheme. There are just over 12,000 people on asylum support or resettlement schemes in Wales, and that covers the Afghan resettlement scheme, the Homes for Ukraine, and the Ukraine Super Sponsor scheme, whereby Welsh Government sponsored a number of Ukraine nationals. Just to put that number in perspective, it represents 0.3% of the population in Wales. And people seeking asylum will have need at particular aspects of their case. So when they initially make their asylum claim, if a case is turned down, people need legal representation for appeals, possibly for a fresh claim. And if an application is accepted and people are granted asylum, then 5 years down the line, they will need to make an application for further leave or for settlement. Another group which it's worth highlighting are international students. There are all of Wales's universities have significant numbers of international students. And the reason for that really is that international students pay much higher fees than home students, and they are essential sources of funding for universities. Because of that, there has in recent years been quite aggressive recruitment of international students by some of the universities in Wales. And international students have complained to us that they've found that they weren't properly informed before they arrived, and they've complained about a lack of support. It's a group, the reason I mention international students is that this is a group who find it very, very difficult to get legal advice. They're not often seen as a priority group by immigration legal services, but they can be very vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. But the important thing to say about the need that we've identified and mapped in the report is that there is need in all local authority areas of Wales. So we then looked at the immigration legal services in Wales, and we've set out in the report the services that are available under legal aid and also under regulated by the Immigration Advice Authority. The provision is very, very low. So there are only now 4 legal aid providers in Wales, and most of those services are concentrated in the southeast of Wales. There's still only a single provider in North Wales based in Wrexham. And in the last financial year, in 2020 to 25, only 894 matter starts were opened in Wales. That figure is lower than during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 to 21, when asylum processing was virtually stopped. So the sector really is at a crisis. And I was saying earlier that there's a crisis across the UK. That's true. But Wales doesn't even get its fair share of that limited supply. Wales hosts 3.4% of people on asylum support, but Wales only has 1.9% of the legal aid provision in England and Wales. And that situation is mirrored in services regulated by the IAA as well. Wales only has 2 level 3 IAA providers. That's the highest level of advice. And there is just now 1 new level 2 provider, and that's Citizens Advice Newport, who've just registered at level 2. The next slide shows a decline in legal aid provision, and I'm not going to spend too long on this slide because that decline has been really well mapped and well publicised. But I think the key things to note on this slide is, as you can see, in 2010 to 2011, provision was around just under 5,000 matter starts, that's cases opened under legal aid per year. And that's come all the way down to 894. There's one key date really on that slide is around 2012, when the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act took most of immigration advice out of the scope of legal aid, and that accounts for that very sharp decline at the beginning. But since then, that decline has continued, and there's been a very steady and very severe decline. But the important thing to note really is that divergence between need and provision. So the orange line at the bottom represents the decline in matter starts, which we've already talked about. The top blue line represents the rise in provision. And there are a number of reasons for that rise in need. Rise in need, not provision. There are a number of reasons for that rise in need. Firstly, there's increased asylum dispersal. So more people are being dispersed to asylum accommodation in Wales. Every local authority now accommodates asylum seekers. People are also in the system for longer as processing has slowed. And there's a huge issue with failure demand. So initial decision making by the Home Office is extremely poor, and that leads to people coming back again for appeal and sometimes making fresh claims. And also not accessing legal services leads to damage and complexity in cases. So more and more people are presenting where they have either not been able to access legal advice earlier on in their case, or they've accessed very poor advice, or in some cases unregulated advice. And that damages cases, it leads to legal providers having to unpick complex cases, and it fills up more capacity. So it leads to a vicious cycle. You have an already overloaded system, which is becoming more and more overloaded as a result of its own failures. It also has severe implications for legal justice and also for social justice. It's a big driver of poverty, including child poverty. It leads people to homelessness, leaves people unable to work, and people end up being exploited. And it sort of creates a parallel society where people are locked out of society. And the last slide for me is looking at that primary legal aid deficit that we recalculated. So we took Joe Wilding's calculations, we updated those for 2024 to 25. And I won't go into exactly how we did that calculation because it is all laid out in the report and it's quite complex. But generally, simply we took the cases that are opened under legal aid, that's that 894 matter starts. We've calculated the number of cases within Wales of people whose cases would be within the scope of legal aid and who would be likely to be looking for legal advice. And we've deducted that from the number of matter starts opened. And that leaves us with a deficit of 4,665 cases. To put that simply, for every 6 people who are looking for legal advice under legal aid in Wales, only one of those people will be able to access that advice or representation. And it's important to note that we're only looking in this deficit of cases which fall into primary scope of legal aid. So not those cases which might be eligible for exceptional case funding and not cases which are out of scope. And in 2023 to 4, Joe Wilding calculated that there are around 46,000 out of scope cases in Wales which urgently need legal representation. And I'm going to pass over to my colleague Elle now, who will talk a little bit about that out of scope provision. Thanks, Elle.
Thank you, Esther. Hello, everyone. I'm Eleanor Matty, and I'm the Access to Justice Project Officer. Before we jump into third sector organisation data, it's important to mention that we spoke with both frontline services and IAA regulated services, which are both vital in the journey to justice, whether that's providing advice at lower levels or at higher levels, which I'll come on to explain shortly, but that's providing support to migrants who are living in Wales, or whether that's being an important source of referral to that essential immigration legal advice. I'm going to be speaking quite a bit about IAA regulation, so I'm just going to give a brief explanation as to what this is and what it means. To be able to offer immigration advice under the Immigration Advice Authority, or the IAA, an organisation must register at a particular level of competence, and an advisor must train to deliver immigration advice at a desired level of competence, and then sit an assessment and pass that assessment. There are 3 levels of competence which break down into 2 different categories of work, and those categories are immigration and asylum and protection. Organisations who are registered at level 1 are able to provide basic advice and do straightforward applications. Swansea Law Clinic are registered at level 1, as is Welsh Refugee Council, British Red Cross and TPG Cymru in partnership with Settled. Organisations regulated by level 2 are able to do complex and discretionary casework. They're able to do representations to UK via on illegal entry, overstayers, removal and deportation, and applications to Secretary of State bail. Up until quite recently, there were no organisations providing level 2 services. However, as I mentioned earlier, Newport Citizens Advice have very recently moved up in regulation and are now the only level 2 provider in Wales. And then finally, we've got level 3, which covers advocacy and representation. Organisations regulated at level 3 are able to do most complex casework, substantive appeals work, pre-action protocol letters in advance of judicial review, and are able to instruct and support counsel in certain circumstances. There are only 2 level 3 accredited organisations in Wales, and that's Asylum, Justice and Settled. I'm going to give a bit of context on citizens' advice and why third sector organisations more broadly are quite important in demonstrating the unmet immigration legal needs. Citizens' advice have a blanket accreditation at IAA level 1, which means that they're able to offer basic advice on immigration and asylum cases. This evidence shows us the importance of level 1 organisations as an initial source of advice, but also as referral agencies to more specialist advice levels. It also shows us the need for legal advice at higher levels is often identified by organisations operating at level 1. So the citizens' advice data shows a slight increase of 7% in immigration and asylum queries in the last financial year. This data is pan-Wales and covers each local authority area. Across Wales, citizens' advice centres have received 516 EU settlement queries, an increase of 21%, and 811 family dependent and partner cases. The largest category in relation to immigration was other, representing 1,169 of cases, which may be the result of the complexity of people's need for immigration advice. It's important to note that these citizens' advice figures may actually be higher because people often present with more than one type of legal need. Therefore, those approaching citizens' advice for help may have immigration needs that aren't reflected in the data if immigration has not been recorded as the main reason for their visit. Oasis Cardiff is an organisation that supports sanctuary seekers to find solicitors and legal services across the UK who are able to assist clients with applications and appeals, as well as providing vital support services to asylum seekers and refugees in and around Cardiff. The graph shows the number of people who have approached Oasis for support in finding legal advice and representation since the year 2023. However, Oasis has reported that there are very few firms across the UK who are able to do appeals representation, but data on the number of people for whom Oasis have been unable to find representation for is not available. Between April and August 2025, Newport Citizens Advice received a total of 67 immigration and asylum cases, of which 40% were referred onwards. And nearly 50% of cases relating to visa eligibility have also been referred onwards, and these cases include skilled worker visas and also family reunion. It's not clear as to where those cases have actually been referred onwards, and it's also important to note that this data was collected when Newport Citizens Advice was operating at IAA level 1, and as I mentioned previously, they have since moved up to IAA level 2. Asylum Justice is the main provider of IAA regulated services in Wales, operating at level 3. In the last financial year, Asylum Justice received 762 referrals, including self-referrals for legal services. Asylum Justice operate an appeals lodging service, and while they are aware that they can't take forward all of the appeals and represent those appeals, the service stops people from losing their appeal rights. Nearly a quarter are referrals to the appeals lodging service, and Asylum Justice provided legal representation for only 37% of the appeals lodged, reserving that capacity for the most vulnerable of cases. It's also unknown whether the remaining number of the appeals lodged actually go on to find representation. We looked at the cases which are firmly within the scope of legal aid, for example, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, initial asylum claims and asylum appeals. We found that potentially as much as 3/4 of Asylum Justice's caseload are cases which legal aid is failing to provide for. And then finally, looking at the sources of referral to asylum justice, we can see which organisations are important in facilitating access to justice. The largest source of referrals came from not-for-profit organisations, accounting for nearly 80% in the last financial year. This includes a number of small grassroots organisations, which shows how important those organisations are in finding legal advice and ensuring people are able to access that legal advice. Nearly 20% of referrals came from local authorities, covering 14 different local authorities in Wales. The highest number coming from Newport City Council, being the most densely populated area outside of Cardiff, followed by Pembrokeshire County Council, which demonstrates that while there is absolutely no provision at all in the West, there is still a need for immigration legal services outside the southeast of Wales. Other statutory services referring to asylum justice are health and education, accounting for 2% of the total referrals in the last financial year. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand you back over to Isa for some conclusions.
So in conclusion, need is going up, provision is going down, and there's a growing gap, and has been for some time, between need and provision, both inside legal aid and outside of it. Essentially, another important point to make is that the need is all the way across Wales in all local authority areas. Migrants are concentrated more in the south and east of Wales, but there is absolutely no provision in many of the areas where this is very much needed. There's a shortage of higher level legal advice. So, for example, for appeals, for complex cases and for exceptional case funding. But it's important, as Elle was saying, to have grassroots organisations, and the data that Elle was showing us earlier demonstrates how vital those organisations are in identifying and referring need to those higher level legal services. There's low provision across the UK, but Wales does not get its fair share of that provision, and the lack of legal aid is having a significant impact on immigration services regulated by the Immigration Advice Authority. The other thing to highlight really is that sheer scale of that unidentified need. Where do those 46,000 people who are looking for legal advice go? The case data that we've been given doesn't even scratch the surface of that need. And this has its significant implications for the strategy that we're developing as well. It means that it needs to be focused on protecting services. We're very much in damage limitation territory and in developing expertise. But it also needs to be a long-term strategy. It needs to look at rebuilding the sector. And there's a desperate need as well for legal aid reform. Legal aid is central to the rebuilding of the legal sector, but we also need to take responsibility at a devolved level to look at what we can do within Wales to rebuild legal services. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. I think, yeah, for your excellent presentations, and I think the report itself makes for some sobering reading as well. I think highlighting the scale of that issue and provides some important context, I think, as well to some politicians who are currently working around the migration system and potential changes to that. About, this is the context that people are going to be operating within in terms of being able to access those rights as well. We have got around 20 odd minutes for questions, so there's plenty of time for discussion. So please get them coming in using the Q&A box. But we've got a couple that got sent in advance, so I might start off with some of those, and I might come up with my own and abuse my own position as chair if people don't start sending them in. But please do. So the first question that got sent in advance was a question around the uplift in legal aid fees that we're due to see from April. Um, do you think that's going to make any difference? Is that going to resolve any of the challenges that you've spoken to in this morning or afternoon rather?
I'll say what I think and then I'll pass over to Elle. So the uplift in fees was announced in April, but it's actually only the regulations have only just been laid to make that uplift possible. So I think it's around 30% for immigration legal aid cases. We have had a lot of consultation with immigration legal aid providers, and the general consensus is that it's not going to make much difference to provision because of the way that legal aid funding has been run down for so long over that period of time. That uplift may help to kind of close the gap in the rising costs, but it's not going to do much to actually increase provision. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Elle.
Yeah, just echoing that really, legal aid has been struggling for quite a long time, and there are fundamental issues with the way legal aid is currently operating. So, or the fees, if the fees are the uplift is to make a difference, we're not going to see it for a long time, but it's not the only solution that needs to take place for legal aid to work in a sustainable and in a financially profitable way for those operating within legal aid.
Just to give a little illustration as well, I have heard from a legal aid provider that the level of funding that they actually get through legal aid is just about enabling them to manage keeping their services going whilst earning pretty much minimum wage. So it's not going to make a huge difference to what is already an extremely low cost, extremely low fee.
And I guess that links to a question we've had in from an anonymous attendee actually about what's stopping law firms seeking legal aid contracts for immigration work. So is it simply that the funding just isn't enough to be worth it if you want to make kind of a decent income, or are there other factors as well that might be stopping kind of more firms getting involved?
I'll let Elle come in on this one because she did quite a lot of research on this when we did our research into immigration legal aid. But just briefly, there is a huge issue of fees. It's not just fees; it's the administration of legal aid as well, can be quite cumbersome. But there's an enormous problem as well in developing expertise. So It costs quite a lot to actually train people up to become legal aid providers and solicitors, but also it takes a lot of supervisory time. And because firms are running very much kind of hand to mouth, there isn't the capacity and there isn't the funding within the organisations to actually develop expertise. And then when people are developed, um, they can earn a much better living outside of the legal aid sector. And so people are leaving the legal aid sector in droves. I think the people really who remain in legal aid are people who are very, very passionate about it and are willing to essentially sacrifice income and careers to do that.
Yeah, and as I just said, when I spoke with quite a few legal aid providers a couple of years ago now, the main message was that it's just not profitable to operate as an immigration and asylum legal aid provider. Law firms are businesses at the end of the day, and they need to turn a profit. And the amount of time that goes into immigration and asylum cases, particularly complex cases, the pay just doesn't cover the amount of work that goes into it. So there's that factor as well. And the way pay is administered, it's really quite problematic, and neither is it an attractive kind of market for a business venture or someone to pick up an immigration legal aid contract, and for new and aspiring young lawyers to join the immigration legal aid sector.
Yeah, and kind of to almost echo what you've been saying, Alex Vessis has commented in the Q&A to say that they're a legal aid provider, and even with the uplift, it won't fully cover the cost of doing the work. Private firms with the experience left to do the work won't be enticed if it cannot be profitable. So again, echoing kind of some of the sentiments you've already shared. And actually, to kind of move us on maybe to a slightly more positive space, Alex had also shared a question that echoes a bit with another one that had in advance around solutions. And in particular, Alex was asking about, and I know this is something that you're coming on to work on next anyway, but um, other things, I imagine that you're going to have a list of things that you might want to get to grips with. Alex's question is, where would you start? What would be the first thing you'd be trying to address?
Okay, that's a very good question. It is a mine because we spent a long time looking at how bad the sector is. And how difficult things are. And then you when I started this project, I did think, how on earth are we going to come up with a strategy? I think, but so there are priority areas. So like I said, we are kind of in damage limitation mode. We can't sort of turn around and say we're going to develop loads of new services in Wales because where's the funding going to come from and where's the expertise going to come from? And just for people who don't really know the sector, we've got a situation where we could develop, if we trained 10, 15, 20 new immigration practitioners tomorrow, there just wouldn't be the services to put them into. So it's kind of like a chicken and an egg situation. So I think where we'd start is to look at firstly funding, emergency funding to protect those services. Where could we get alternative sources of funding from? Could we encourage more local authorities perhaps to pay for the services that they're referring people to? Could we get more health funding into the sector? There's a whole range of possible solutions. And then secondly, it's about building expertise. So how can we develop expertise, but how can we also create career paths for people into the sector? So rather than just paying for training or having a scheme which trains, like having an apprenticeship scheme, for example, you've got to think about that whole journey. How does somebody go from training to actually practicing, and then to developing those skills? And we also want to look at whether it's possible to support organisations to go up in levels in immigration, in IAA levels, but also within legal aid services. So could there be a kind of support and supervision hub to developed? Could there be some way of ensuring that supervision is available to a range of organisations, that organisations are supported to develop their staff? And can we build infrastructure? So can we help organisations to talk to each other about cases, to maybe even share staff? And what can be done really to make sure that some of the non-legal services as well are carried out more and are more embedded in frontline services. So we've got that relationship going between frontline services and legal services as well. But those are just some of the things that we're looking at the moment.
Ab. Anything to add to that one, El? Or if not, I think the next one I might come to you first. As the youngest person among us, we've had a question from an anonymous attendee that could have actually links to one of the things I was talking about was training staff is great, but if they haven't got space to go into, you kind of what's the point? And there's two questions here, so feel free to address either. Is what's the role of law schools in bringing capacity into the voluntary sector? And I know that's something that you did a bit of work on during your university days. And how do we make immigration law an attractive option?
That's a great question. Um, I think law schools are really, really, really important in building new expertise and sparking an interest in immigration law and capacity building in the long run. As I mentioned earlier, Swansea Law Clinic are operating at level one. I used to volunteer with Swansea Law Clinic when I was in university there, but there just aren't the pathways. And the law, I think, if we utilise the law schools, they need to be utilised in a way that, okay, we've got interested students. Where can these students go? Which services are they able to go into? Are there sort of kind of apprenticeship type schemes that they're able to kind of just fast track through? We've seen with Newfields Law have been doing an immigration academy, which, and I went to the graduation and met quite a lot of the students in the academy who have such an interest into going into immigration advice in under the IAA, but they just don't know how to progress that. They don't know where to go beyond that school. And I think there's a role for universities here actually teaching practical immigration law, because, I don't know, international law seems the attractive market to kind of teach on now. But actually, I think not just the law schools, but the actual courses need to kind of focus back on immigration so that the interest is sparked, and then there are the pathways for people to go down if they want to.
Yeah, and I think that's been a long challenge for the law schools as well, hasn't it? That's been thrown at the university sectors in terms of stuff like studying devolved law more broadly. Are we doing enough within our universities to tailor people to give them the skills that we need people within the sector to have as well on stuff that was more broadly? So I think that makes a lot of sense. I've got Hashminda has sent in a question about. Do you think the divisive political climate and distrust in the police to protect people from hate crimes makes students afraid to enter the field? I don't know if either of you fancy a go at answering that
I
first.
I think that's a really interesting question. It's not one I've thought about, to be honest, but I think you have to ask yourself whether it's an attractive field to go to and go into. I don't want to put people off from going into it, but there is a lot of fear around at the moment. Um, but I think that fear is kind of there anyway, and obviously it depends who you are as well, how you attract that. Maybe you don't want to put your head up above the parapet and go into that field, but um, I think we can't allow ourselves to be ruled by that fear, and I'm very much seeing people talking about the concerns a lot, which we need to do, but I don't think we can let that run our lives. And I think that there is still like I was saying, we've spoken to students who are very enthusiastic about going into the immigration advice sector. Um, Given the low fees, the worries about potential far right attacks, the vicarious trauma, all of the things that go in the in the legal services sector, we still have people who really, really want to go into it, and we still have people who are really, really staying into it. That says something about how rewarding working in that sector can actually be, and how important it is to help people. So I don't think that fear will put everybody off. But it may well have an effect on some people's willingness to go into it.
actually, interestingly, I said James has commented in the Q&A box to say that they haven't seen any drop off in demand for IAA training as a result of the current climate. If anything, it has increased.
Yeah.
Um, so possibly where that climate though is having a greater impact is at a political level, around choices being made, etc. That is not then providing the funding to provide the avenues for those people. I'm sure James is seeing to get them into those opportunities. So the fear might actually be with people with the greater agency rather than the people on the ground trying to do some of the more frontline delivery stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, and I think there's a lot at the higher level where there's a lot of kind of running scared and trying to avoid things which maybe actually might not in reality be that much of an issue, and maybe
Yeah.
we need to stand up a little bit more and assert ourselves in the face of that fear.
Interestingly, and again, you can see there's different tiers of stuff going on here as well. Hazel then had commented to say that she can see it having an impact on volunteers for grassroots organizations. So you can maybe the absolute volunteers, you've got then students and people who want to train to in space. You can see the different stuff going on, but absolutely very, very interesting. Um, I think we've got 5 odd minutes left if people got any more questions. We've got one here or a comment here from Beth Kidd, who has asked, we aspire to be regulated at IAA level 2, but the biggest stumbling block is getting supervision in place, as we have to look externally for it from a sector that is incredibly overstretched and underfunded. Do you have any creative ways we could try and resolve this? This might be something for phase 2, I suppose.
Well, it is actually one of the things that we are looking at, is whether we can set up some kind of hub that would offer remote supervision. And there are lots of complications with that. People do need to kind of shadow a worker. They need to work alongside people. But I think that's where that kind of bringing together people and infrastructure and creating partnerships also helps. Whether we can get some of the existing organisations to work alongside other organisations to ensure that that supervision is put in place, and whether maybe that could also be an income earner for those organisations. So it's quite complicated. What we are going to do actually is to set up some working groups to look at those hubs. So if anybody is interested in joining those working groups, please do contact us if you want to look at some creative ways. But yes, we will, and I think that's creativity is really the key. We do have to look at new ways and different ways, and maybe consider things that we wouldn't normally have thought of before. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun actually. Challenging but fun.
Yeah, and just to say that Joe Biden has come back to Beth's comment and saying that she agrees as well that it is that single biggest challenge. So it sounds like an area, as you said, there's potentially a lot of fun to be had. Kind of taking a look at some options there. So I can't see any other questions having come in. So I guess one thing that had been swirling in my mind and might just kind of use my position as chair to ask when both people have one last chance to come forward with a question. Is that point you have about the different parts of Wales as well, and I guess about kind of the awareness. What awareness is there actually outside? Are people aware that the demand is there? Clearly, someone is, because someone is forwarding on people to organisations in Cardiff and Newport to access that legal advice. But actually, beyond that, do you think there is that broader awareness that this is a problem across the whole of Wales, not just a thing in the southeast, and that everywhere else can forget about it?
Yes, I think within the sector that awareness is there. I think definitely people know. I mean, the organisations who are providing legal advice know where that those requests are coming from. I think there's a lot of hidden demand because what we see, we know about what people suffer when they can't get legal advice, and we know what the challenges are through the people who come to frontline organisations. But we know from the statistics that that's quite a small proportion of people who actually need that advice. So there are people out there who are hidden, and so there are needs that we don't know about and that possibly services don't know about. I think probably where the lack of awareness is maybe is amongst um, possibly the legal aid agency, possibly funders at a higher level. Maybe we need to bring more attention to that need across Wales as well and make sure that people don't just continue to think that people need only need legal advice in Newport and Cardiff. And I say that with caution, because there is a desperate need for more legal advice in Newport and Cardiff as well.
Yeah, yeah, ab absolutely. Elle, you've taken yourself off mute. Was there something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I agree. Those who are working in the sector are very much aware of the shortage in providers, you know, pan Wales, and we're in a situation now where there are fewer and fewer providers. So, I mean, we can count on one hand how many legal aid providers there are in Wales. And if you're working um, in the immigration and asylum support, or you are someone who needs immigration and asylum advice, you're going to know that there are only certain buildings in Wales in 4 locations and a few extra third sector organisations who can provide you advice. And if you're living in Pembrokeshire, that might actually be really difficult to find. And also, if you think about international students, for example, there are universities scattered all across Wales, and not every international student will need legal advice, but those who do need it will have to go privately if they can't find an organisation who can give it for free. So the need is still there, and that's also within the universities as well. So I think within the sector, yes, people know about it, but do the people who need to know about it, such as universities, because they could be a really good source of immigration advice to international students, for example.
Yeah, ab absolutely. Um, I think that's a really good point to bring it to an end. There's been a few more comments in the Q&A box about level two supervision, etc., which I'm sure will be useful for us to pick up as we think about stuff for the next phase of the project. But I can't see any more questions directly on that. So, given that we are coming up to quarter to two in any case, I think probably time to wind up the discussion. Thanks everyone for coming along and for so many of you staying with us right until the end of the discussion as well. The report is now on our website, I think I'm right in saying, and as I said, the recording will be available shortly. And as Isis said, the offer is there to work with us on this as we move forward. So if you've heard anything today, or got any thoughts, any ideas about how you want to work with us going forward, please reach out to us. We'd be eager to hear from any of you. So with nothing else to add, I'd just say diolch yn fawr, and we'll see you again soon.